Take a look at this chart. It shows GDP per person growth of all the G7 countries between 2019 and 2023. And look at Canada, it's right there at the bottom, second only to Britain. While our GDP per person has shrunk over that period, in the US it's grown by 6%. Now you might be asking, who cares? What does this chart and this economics jargon about GDP per person have to do with me? Well, GDP per person is one of the main ways to measure how rich people are in a country, and that does have something to do with you. When a country's GDP per person shrinks, the economic pie that everyone in that country shares gets smaller, which tends to make your slice of that pie smaller. When GDP per person grows, the average slice of that economic pie gets bigger, which means that people get richer. Now, this is a bit of a simplification. You could have a very unequal country where a few people get very rich at the top while everyone else stays the same or even gets poorer, and GDP per person could still be going up. But it's still a useful way to ballpark how rich people are in any given country. So when Canada's GDP per person starts to shrink or stop growing, it is a cause for concern because it suggests that people in Canada generally aren't getting any richer. And of course, it's not the only factor, but I do think you are starting to see this show up in people's lives where we find that we can't really afford the same quality of life that we could 10 or 20 years ago, whether it comes to going grocery shopping and what we can afford to buy there, or the sort of homes that we can afford to live in. So why is this happening? Why is Canada falling behind other developed, rich countries? There are a bunch of reasons, but here are a few of the big ones. First are demographics. Canada is getting older. 20 years ago, the average age of Canadian was around 38. Now it's 41. In 20 years, the forecasts say that around 5% of Canadians will be over the age of 85. That's more than double the amount today. That means fewer people in the country are working because they're retired, which reduces per person GDP. But this doesn't really explain why Canada is lagging behind other developed countries because they all have this demographics problem. So what else is going on? One possibility is that Canadian businesses invest less in machines and equipment compared to businesses in other countries. And that's important because when businesses invest more in tools and equipment and machines for their workers tend to be more productive, which increases GDP per person. Now, the economics term for how much businesses invest in this sort of stuff is called gross fixed capital formation. And in the past 10 years, it's increased by 51% in Canada. Now let's compare that to other countries. In Germany, it's increased by 57%. In the US, it's increased by 61% over the same period of time. So compared to these other rich countries, we're investing less in this sort of capital that makes workers more productive. Businesses in Canada are also investing less in this as a share of our total GDP. 20 years ago, the amount that Canadian businesses were investing in this capital equipment was around 6% of GDP. Now it's just 3.1%. You can see this in other metrics too, like if you look at the amount of robots per worker in different countries, you'll see that among developed countries, Canada is almost at the bottom. The result of this is that workers in other countries tend to have more machines and equipment and tools to do their job, which makes them more productive, which increases GDP per person. And if you think about it, this makes intuitive sense, even if you don't look at the economics jargon. If I have a job where I make 10 widgets per day, and there's a machine that I could buy that would get me to make 20 widgets per day, then without that machine, I'm only working at half of my productive potential. But to get that productivity gain, my employer has to go out and buy that machine so I can use it. And in Canada, that's happening less often than it is in other rich countries. So I think the question then is, why do Canadian businesses invest less in these machines and equipment than businesses in other countries? Why did they stop investing in this stuff? I think it's really hard to answer that question with certainty, but my personal theory is that one of the big reasons is that they just don't have to in order to compete. First of all, labor in Canada is relatively cheap. Our population has grown faster than any of the other developed economies in the past 10 years, which has driven down, in a lot of sectors, the price of workers. So you don't have to get new machines and new robots and equipment when you can just hire people for relatively small wages. Businesses just don't have as much incentive to invest in labor-saving, productivity-enhancing equipment. Now, other people, if you ask them about this, will also point to competition and how a lot of industries in Canada are protected from foreign competitors and so don't have to compete as hard in order to win business. I think this is a plausible theory, but I'm not sure that we have the data or evidence that we need in order to confirm it or really understand how much it contributes to this problem. Now, with all that being said, I should not end this video without pointing out that a lot of people criticize GDP per person as a good measure of how Canada's economy is doing. And the reason for that is because our population has grown so quickly over the past 5 to 10 years through immigration. And according to them, it will take time for people who are new to Canada to get into jobs that maximize their skills and therefore maximize their productivity. So in that sense, GDP per person may be a lagging indicator in the case of Canada for how our economy is doing relative to other developed countries. Now, I'm not sure if that's true. I guess we'll find out in the coming years, but I don't think it makes sense to totally write off GDP per person as a good way to measure ourselves relative to other rich economies. And when you ask Canadians if they're optimistic about our economy these days, I do think you get numbers that kind of reflect what's happening with GDP per person. Only 21% of people say they're optimistic about where our economy is going, and only 11% say that they think they'll be able to actually increase their discretionary spending in the near future. That's a pretty pessimistic attitude, and I think one that reflects people's sense that their slice of the economic pie is shrinking. So there does seem to be a connection between the sort of abstract data that I showed you in this chart at the start of this video and what's actually happening in Canadians' lives.